Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the community of independent thinkers. The elites in Washington are cheering. The mainstream media is celebrating what they call a perfectly coordinated military campaign between the United States and Israel against Iran. They are selling you a cheap myth about restoring peace. They are selling you a myth about deterring evil and protecting regional stability. They tell you that the United States and Israel are standing shoulder to shoulder with the exact same strategic vision. Brush those cheap lies aside. What we are truly witnessing is not a brilliant victory. It is a strategic suicide. It is the bloody collapse of an arrogant delusion. And as time passes, the fracture between the objectives of these two nations will only deepen into a gaping abyss. Washington believes it can wage a clean war. They think that by bombing air defense networks into the dirt, evaporating ballistic missile stockpiles, and annihilating the Iranian Navy, the adversary will simply fall to its knees and surrender. This is an incredibly dangerous level of naivete. They evaluated the situation with blinding optimism, genuinely believing that decapitating the senior leadership on the very first day would cause the entire regime to crumble like a house of cards. They were even delusional enough to expect the Iranian people to pour into the streets and overthrow their own government. History has proven the exact opposite dozens of times. Bombing a nation does not disintegrate it. Bombing a nation strangles internal dissent and forges a population into a unified nationalist bloc. The ruthless truth is that a severely weakened Iran still holds a fistful of deadly cards to play. Look directly at the mechanism of economic weaponization unfolding right now. Western policymakers willfully ignored the brutal material reality of geography. They forgot about the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a small creek. This is the jugular vein pumping lifeblood into the entire global economy. Iran closing or threatening this waterway is not a novel concept. It has been a staple in Pentagon war game scenarios for decades. Yet Washington marched into this war without a shred of diplomatic or political preparation to handle the fallout. Iran does not need to defeat advanced American fighter squadrons in the sky. They only need to float naval mines. They only need to launch cheap drones to ravage cargo ships and strangle the flow of energy. Do you think oil crossing $100 a barrel is just a lifeless number on a ticker tape? Absolutely not. That is inflation tearing apart the wallets of American workers. That is an economic earthquake capable of pushing the world to the brink of a total financial meltdown. This leads us to an undeniable truth regarding the life and death divergence of interest between the United States and Israel. For Israel, eradicating the regime in Tehran is an absolute mandate for survival. Surrounded by hostile forces for decades, constantly weathering storms of ballistic missiles and living under the daily wail of air raid sirens, the Israeli public is willing to pay any price to tear this threat out by the roots. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu does not need to spend political capital convincing his domestic audience because the public support for crushing an existential threat is overwhelmingly massive. A small nation prioritizing its core security simply does not care about fractured global supply chains or the panic of financial markets. Even if the Iranian regime collapses and leaves behind a chaotic black hole, a bloody civil war, or a tidal wave of refugees flooding into Europe, Israel would remain profoundly satisfied because their ultimate adversary was destroyed. They want to drag this war out. They want to boil the pressure cooker until the regime in Tehran vaporizes into ash. But the United States is not a small nation in the Middle East. The United States is a global empire entering a phase of evaporating power, and this empire cannot afford the burden of another deadly regime change war. President Donald Trump is facing a mountain of domestic political pressure. He rambles endlessly to the media but remains profoundly inconsistent regarding his core strategic objectives. The American people are deeply confused, and public support for this military adventure is scraping the bottom of the barrel. Why should Americans send their sons and daughters to bleed on Middle Eastern deserts and suffer crippling inflation at home just to solve a regional security puzzle that does not directly threaten the survival of the American homeland? You must understand that America has embarked on these bloody regime change crusades before. Look at Iraq. We destroyed it. Look at Libya. We turned it into a slave market. Look at Syria. We threw it into a sea of fire. Every single time we try to plant democracy with high explosives, we reap absolute chaos and drain our national wealth. History is repeating itself with blind precision. We have been dragged into a miserable scenario where Washington has its hands tied by political calculus. As the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz escalates, President Trump has turned to threatening and coercing NATO allies to deploy warships to police the maritime routes. It is a display of ultimate bitter irony. The United States slapped punitive tariffs on Europe and trampled on allied interests for years, and now, when the war machine bogs down, Washington demands their blood to clean up the wreckage we created without even consulting them before firing the first shot. Being generous with the blood of others has never been a sustainable strategy. The historical axis of the past 30 years proves that every time the United States attempts to maintain hegemony by directly intervening militarily in non-core regions, it digs a grave for its own material power. President Trump will soon realize he must declare a hollow victory and find a way to flee as quickly as possible before the American economy is strangled to death. However, a ceasefire declaration from a podium in Washington does not mean the artillery in Tehran will fall silent. The adversary will continue delivering blows until they secure terms they can live with. The most ruthless and catastrophic aspect of this entire campaign is not located in the Middle East. It is located in Eurasia. Every localized conflict serves as a global strategic classroom. Do you think Beijing and Moscow are anxious? They are not. They are throwing a victory party. They are watching us commit geopolitical suicide. Every single day, the American fleet exposes itself in the Persian Gulf. Every hour, our naval maintenance yards are maxed out, and every expensive interceptor missile leaving its launch tube is a layer of armor stripped directly from the Pacific theater. How can the United States deter China? How can we deter a true peer competitor armed with colossal industrial capacity when our strategic magazines are empty and our air defense resources are bled dry? How can Europe defend its own territory when all the most advanced weapon systems have been blown to pieces in the Middle East? And look at Russia. The strangulation of oil flows pushing energy prices through the roof has directly recapitalized the entire Russian military-industrial complex. Western sanctions transform into worthless scraps of paper when massive revenues from energy exports feed their war machine in Ukraine. We are shooting ourselves in the foot with a cannon. This strategic misalignment expands further into Lebanon. Israel, operating on a mindset of clearing out existential threats, is pursuing a parallel campaign to crush the military capabilities of Hezbollah. They want to use overwhelming destructive firepower to force the Lebanese government to disarm the group, something the previous ceasefire completely failed to achieve. Washington might not care deeply about this specific front and appears ready to turn a blind eye, allowing Israel to act independently. But this only exposes the brutal reality that the United States is being sucked into an endless regional vortex of violence without any clearly defined strategic exit ramp. The future is remarkably bleak. When the magazines run dry and inflation crushes the patience of the American voter, Washington will be forced to cut its losses. The fracture between an Israel hungry for the total destruction of the Tehran regime and an exhausted America desperate to flee will detonate into a massive alliance crisis. We lied to ourselves. We ignored the ruthless laws of material power and the balance of power. The true enemy, our actual peer competitor in the Eastern Hemisphere, stretches its legs and wakes up while we bleed to death in meaningless wars manufactured by our own hubris. Keep yourselves safe, stay sharp, and never stop questioning the lies fed to you by the elites. The truth is still out there. I will see you next time.